on Talk Radio.
Good morning to you. Thank you very much indeed for your company. Very much appreciate you joining me. Benedict Spence is still with me. He's a Conservative commentator. We'll get his thoughts on what my next guest has to say on various topics in just a few moments. Delighted to welcome the Labour Shadow Housing Secretary, Lucy Powell, to the show. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Julia.
Lots to talk about. Obviously, I do want to touch on not just our unemployment figures out this morning, and also, of course, this Indian variant of COVID and the effect it's having on lockdown easing. But first up, you are in a crucial Queen's Speech vote in the House of Commons today, calling on the government to act now, you say, to save lives and livelihoods and fix the building safety crisis. Tell us what you want.
Well, as you say, we do want the government now to actually act and show some leadership on this issue, because we have thousands, if not tens of thousands, of people still living in dangerous buildings, in dangerous blocks, many of them now unable to get insurance, unable to sell their property. So this is a crisis of huge proportions. And we had a fire in East London just a couple of weeks ago at the New Providence Wharf, a building which is covered in the same cladding that the Grenfell Tower was covered in, and residents there, thankfully, safe. But it was a very frightening situation where the fire was spreading. So there really should be a wake-up call for the government to act faster now.
Well, we had wake-up calls before Grenfell that were ignored, and we had inquiries, and then we had Grenfell, which was very much a big wake-up call, and sadly costing the life of 72 innocent people. And yet we've still, as you say, got all these people in these homes, and there's been help for people in council properties. And initially this was claimed to be, it's a big issue. This was, rich v poor, no one cared about poor people. Turns out there are hundreds of thousands of people who live in private dwellings, they bought themselves in the same situation. What would it cost for the government to basically take over this issue and pay for it all?
Well, we don't actually know, because one of the things that government have failed to do is to do what other countries like Australia have done, which is a full audit of all the buildings that have got dangerous cladding or dangerous works that now need remediation because of the failure of building regulations over recent years. So they haven't done that. So we don't know the full cost. The government have set aside a pot of money that is £5 billion. There's lots of problems with that funding because of the scope, of the tight deadline, of the first come, first served basis of it. The government aren't doing enough to claw back that money from the developers, the builders, the building block owners who erected these buildings in the first place. So we're not sure how much it would cost, but what we are sure of is that government really do now need to put a deadline of June 2022, which would be 5 years since Grenfell, to say that all dangerous cladding will be removed. And the government can do and should do now what they've said they would do but keep failing to do, which is give a cast iron promise in legislation to leaseholders and other residents that they won't have to pay the costs of this remediation work.
It seems to me, exactly, we discussed this on the show many times, that this was a hideous failing on so many different counts, but at the very least it was a failing in terms of the building regulations being either clear or being actually upheld. And at some point we just simply cannot allow hundreds of thousands of people who've done nothing wrong having to pay the costs of this. And I have to say I'm with you all the way on this one. It seems just to be only a matter of what is right to do. Let's talk about whether it's right for us to be having more freedoms. As of yesterday, people apparently being told they could hug their loved ones for the first time outside their own households. People going back to the pub and restaurants indoors, and being allowed to travel abroad for the first time legally without exceptional extenuating circumstances. Do you think it was the right decision to continue lockdown easing, or are you concerned about this new variant, and should it stop us from going to full end of lockdown on June the 21st?
I think it's probably too early to say about the June point. I think that if you look at the roadmap in general and the criteria for easing of lockdown, we were quite clearly at a national level, we are meeting those criteria. The vaccination levels are going up and are very high, some of the highest in the world. The infection rate has been largely falling. It's now rising, obviously in some places, but in general is still low and steady. And the pressure on hospitals and the number of deaths are significantly lower than they have been through most of the pandemic, apart from last summer. So on those measures, I think you can't come to any other conclusion other than the roadmap could be continued with. I think obviously what we don't know between now and June is whether this new variant and the very sharp rises in infection rates we are seeing in some very localized areas, whether that will become more widespread and therefore could then put pressure on hospitals and elsewhere, because there are still millions of people not vaccinated.
Well, there are millions of people who are not vulnerable, who are not vaccinated, aren't there? I mean, there are people who've been vaccinated in vulnerable categories for whom, sadly, they think possibly 5 to 10%, the vaccine doesn't work effectively. Maybe we could give all those people antibody tests and then warn them they perhaps, if they want to, their choice, shield more if they so choose. But for everybody else who's been vaccinated, this variant is affected by the vaccine. There's no evidence that it doesn't. Evidence that it does is mounting day by day. Is there any reason why, because some people in some pockets of our country choose not to get vaccinated, that should stop anyone else from getting their fundamental civil liberties back?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a slight oversimplification, if you don't mind me
what's so simple about it?
Well, I think, look, I think this is a complex sort of situation that is clearly worrying. I do agree with you that obviously when large proportions of the population, including the most vulnerable, are vaccinated, one would hope and expect that life can then begin to get back to normal. I think the one thing we just need to be careful of in relation to this particular variant, we've seen this in India, haven't we already? And we're seeing it now in places like Bolton and Blackburn, that it does seem to be very easily transmitted. So even though most of the vulnerable are vaccinated, if it was to spread extremely quickly amongst the younger population that is not vaccinated, you are still going to get significant numbers of younger people very ill with it if it spread extremely quickly. So I think that's why you've got to keep these things under review. What I would say, though, is that what public health officials in Greater Manchester, in Bolton and elsewhere are calling for is a much now more widespread surge vaccinations across those areas, including younger people, to sit alongside the surge testing. And we've got the vaccine supply now. I just don't see why that should be delayed in any way. Let's do whatever we can to contain this variant in the places that it is already.
Isn't part of the problem, and it's a big elephant in the room, that we know that the people who largely haven't got vaccinated are ethnic minorities. Asian communities, actually particularly black communities, often in urban areas, are not getting vaccinated. This is the Indian variant brought in by British people travelling in from India, and it's seeded in these areas with strong Asian communities. When white people don't get the vaccine, they are labelled as anti-vaxxers, science deniers, COVID deniers. When people of ethnic minorities in this country don't en masse, I mean, we're talking, in some cases, 20 or 30% not getting, in some communities, not choosing to get the vaccine. Every right not to do it, in my view. It's a free country. But when they choose not to get the vaccine, people tend to, particularly politicians, tend to tiptoe around this. The media tends to tiptoe around this. Do we not have a major cultural issue here of some isolated communities living a sort of parallel life, something that David Cameron picked on a few years ago, who are not doing what the vast majority of the British public is doing, which is going along with vaccines. Now, I defend people's right not to get a vaccine if that is what they so choose, but there is an issue here, isn't there? And it makes everyone very uncomfortable, so people don't like to talk about it. But there may be a time when we're going to see a breakdown in race relations in this country, when a lot of people are going to say, why have I not got my freedoms back? Why has my business gone under? Why have I lost my job? Because some people in Bolton or Blackburn or wherever are choosing not to get the vaccine.
Well, I don't really accept the premise of your question, and I don't think it's helpful at all for us to start sort of pitting one community against another.
No, but I didn't, did I? I didn't. It is a simple matter of fact that the people who aren't getting vaccinated in these pockets,
it's not just a matter of fact,
are largely ethnic minority communities who have chosen not to get the vaccine on a much wider scale than those in white communities.
No, No,
That's not the
it's
case?
it's not a fact. No, there
65% take up of the vaccine of over 70s in African communities, and it's around the 75-80% in Asian communities by and large, 95% plus in white communities. There is a clear ethnic divergence there.
Okay, there are differences in the take up of the vaccine amongst communities, but to suggest that somehow this what is happening in Bolton and Blackburn at the moment is entirely the fault of one community,
I haven't used the word
because
fault.
because they have chosen not to take the vaccine, I think is completely wrong. I mean, let's not forget, by the way, that the very, very powerful third wave that we had in this country, or second wave, depending on which way you're looking at it, was the so-called Kent variant. You know, the variants can come from all places.
No, I'm not. I'm not blaming India. I'm not blaming Indians. I've used no words involving fault. I'm talking about some simple facts. That the vast majority of people in this country who are vulnerable to the virus, who are white, have taken the vaccine, and not enough people who are of ethnic minorities have been taking the vaccine in vulnerable categories, and therefore they are more at risk of being hospitalised or dying. That is a tragedy for them and for their families. We need to encourage more people to do it. I don't want to force people. I want to cajole, educate, encourage. But it is nevertheless a fact. Do you not think there is a risk if we do see that divergence, which is clearly available in the statistics? This is not my supposition. These are official statistics. And this is a serious issue that the government and others have been trying to tackle. That if we do see this divergence, that is not going to do race relations in this country any good at all.
No, but I think all the assumptions you're making in what you're saying are not going to help either. So yes,
what assumptions did I make?
Can I speak? Because you're not actually letting me say anything.
But you keep mischaracterising what I'm saying.
I don't know, because what you're trying to present to your listeners is that somehow the issue in Bolton and Blackburn is because of lack of vaccine take-up amongst certain communities in those places. That's not the case.
Is it not?
It's a much more complex picture than that. And actually, the vast majority of transmission and the vast increases in transmission that's happening in those places are because of younger people. It's amongst younger people. The older people are, because most of them have been vaccinated, you know, there's much less transmission happening in those age groups of people that have been vaccinated. You do have a valid point that in some communities there have been less take up of the vaccine. That's actually the gap between that divergence is narrowing, not growing.
Yeah, that's true.
But as people are now taking the vaccine, more people are coming forward from perhaps from some communities where, you know, there is greater mistrust of health services and of information passed around and so on. And there are other reasons why that would be the case. And we have to take on those reasons. We have to go out and knock on people's doors and encourage them to do that. That's what they're doing in Bolton and Blackburn and elsewhere, and we really need extra capacity in there to do that. But there are, for your listeners, need to know there are very, very large white communities in Bolton as well, and the as I say, the sharp increases in infections are happening among young, unvaccinated people. So this is really the issue we need to take on.
The hospitalisations in Bolton have been among people who've been offered the jab, and therefore not the young people. They would have been certainly over 40 and probably over 50. Look, I'm with you. We're all on the same side. We want people who to get the vaccine.
It's relatively small. Yeah, okay. It's still relatively small, the hospitalisations, and that gets back to your first point, which is, you know, the more people who are vaccinated. Yep. The more we can return to our usual liberties.
Lucy Powell, Labour's